Not as Nature Intended by Rich Hardy. The Prologue, 1999. I watched the silhouette of 5 dolphins rear up in the wave face and then go left as I stroked over the top of the breaking wave. Just as I had harnessed the previous wave's energy to race down the line using the fins of my surfboard to spray droplets of water back into their salty home, these creatures were here for the same reason, to surf the waves, pure enjoyment. And it wasn't just the dolphins. Nature was throwing a party. Seabirds were base jumping from nearby cliffs, their long beaks splitting the water's surface with minimal disruption. Fish leaped and fronds of kelp waved at me as I duck dived my board, under and through the lip of every watery chandelier that broke in front of me. Surfing was my release. It still is. It provides me with an opportunity to see the best of what nature has to offer, even at a time when nature is taking a battering at the hands of humans. But that day, despite all that awe and wonder, I couldn't shake off the sight of the giant sheds on the road running down to the beach, or the telltale, foul-smelling odour above them. I hadn't expected to find a factory farm in such an idyllic spot. As a professional campaigner working on behalf of animal organisations for nearly a decade, I was very aware of what was inside those sheds. Hens, tens of thousands of them, each one genetically selected to put every ounce of energy they could muster into the production of an egg a day. An egg so clean and so perfect, surely it could only be laid by prize hens, living the most lavish of chicken lives. Not so. I knew that these hens were kept locked up in battery cages so small they couldn't even stretch their wings. I had taken a year off from campaigning to go to New Zealand, exploring remote sections of the East Coast and seeking out lonely waves to surf. Just a few months earlier, my colleagues and I had secured a monumental campaign victory that saw the European Union outlaw the use of barren battery cages for egg-laying hens. Ultimately, those barren cages were replaced with so-called enriched cages, which offered some basic improvements in the form of a nest box, perches and a dust-bathing area. Of course, enriched cages were never going to be the answer. A cage is still a cage. But getting any factory farming system banned was a huge challenge. To end one of the worst examples of factory farming and to see the industry have to shell out huge sums of money to change their system, it cost £400 million in the UK alone, was worth celebrating. It offered hope and showed the industry that change was coming, and they were going to have to pay for it. It was a victory hard won, and I was exhausted. Working full-time on that campaign had taken everything out of me, and I needed a recharge before I could contemplate returning to more work for animals. So I dusted down my surfboard and travelled to New Zealand, the first stop in what would be a year-long surf trip. A few days later, and having parted with a good chunk of dollars to buy a beaten-up Mitsubishi van in which to live and travel, I was sitting on my board beyond the breaking waves. A lull in the waves had got me reflecting on the hens in those sheds. During the campaigning period, I had undertaken a lot of talks and given interviews in the media about why it was wrong to keep hens in battery cages. I had a convincing patter and knew all the scientific and ethical arguments, but I had never actually seen hens in cages for myself. I considered this a weakness when it came to lobbying, and on several occasions this was underlined when I was undermined by the opposition and also by decision makers capable of creating change for hens. And while the campaign had been successful, there weren't vast banks of film footage available to reference, so campaigners were very reliant on written evidence, such as scientific reports, to make their case. I couldn't help thinking that if there were more imagery available to show people and politicians what life was really like inside these dreadful factory farms, it might be possible to speed up the rate of change. The next set of waves came through and I paddled hard for the first wave. The lip threw out far enough for me to sneak inside the barrel. and for a split second, I was enveloped in the swirling, watery mass. On exiting, instead of continuing down the green wall that was offering a much longer ride, I directed my board towards the beach. Even though I was on holiday, I was going to that farm above the beach, and I was going to look inside. I felt this was something I could and had to do for myself. With hair still dripping wet, I parked the van in a lay-by. Without looking for a towel, I peeled off my wetsuit and grabbed my video camera from the footwell in the passenger seat before I could change my mind. I didn't really look after it very well. It was always getting a battering from the extreme weather while documenting the surf trips I was making. As I walked towards the farm, I frantically rubbed grains of sand and surf wax from its outer casing and cleaned the lens with my t-shirt. All seemed quiet. It was lunchtime, so perhaps the workers were eating in the main house. I knew that hundreds of thousands of dollars were spent on building factory farms like this to keep the hens in and the public out. Designed like a fortress, this one had no windows and really offered no clues as to what was on the inside if you were an outsider. Long, dark shadows cast from the tall buildings, which incarcerated the unfortunate hens, smothered the ground. It was a foreboding place, set back from a rural road, and with no close neighbours, its considered positioning would normally be enough to keep the animals out of sight and out of mind. But not today. Despite all the investment, the physical barriers, and the foreboding atmosphere, it was the lack of a simple $10 padlock that enabled me to get inside. Without even considering what I would say if I were confronted, I slid back the giant door of one of the sheds. I instinctively slipped the toggle off the camera to record, and its little red light lit up a pathway in the darkness for me to follow. While the light level was low, the noise was not. Though I couldn't yet see them, I could hear squawking and the flapping of wings against metal from beyond another steel door. It was unlocked. I looked back over my shoulder, still no one, so I opened the door. Like high-rise flats, the battery cages rose up all around me in every direction. I suddenly felt quite small amongst them and found my eyes straining in the poor light to judge how far back they went. It was a long way, too long to calculate from inside. Feathers were falling from the highest tiers and hens were taking it in turns to jut out their scrawny necks through gaps in the cage bars. Just as I would frequently strain to come up from air after being pile-driven beneath the surface of the sea from a particularly fearsome wave, it struck me that these birds were doing something similar. I felt like it was freedom they were reaching out for. With wide eyes and gaping beaks, they grabbed their moments away from the cage before a cage mate jostled them out of position for their turn. On and on it went down the aisle. Like a cash register springing into action, thousands of hens were trying to escape from the wire mesh prisons they were forced to endure for their 18-month life. Such a short and miserable life for a bird that could in natural settings live for 8 to 10 years. This barren system forms the foundation for how factory farming works. It is completely reliant on cages, crates, or vast indoor warehouses where animals are packed in at the highest stocking densities. They restrict space, and by doing so, deny natural animal behaviour. It is this system that produces the bulk of the world's meat, eggs, and dairy. Their overgrown claws curled around the sloping wire floors of their cages. Their bodies were a 50-50 mix of feathers and sore skin. I already knew this was not a natural molt, though feathers were pulled out by each other through a combination of stress and boredom. To mitigate the damage this caused, the farmer had made sure all his hens had arrived with beaks trimmed. A painful but legal process, carried out with a red-hot blade. This was an industry solution to preventing the worst injuries from the hens pecking at each other. Halfway down the aisle, I found my first corpse, rotting in a far corner of the cage. It must have been here for days. I couldn't imagine trying to check these cages each day for birds that had fallen sick or injured. It would be a huge job.